My mother maintained perfect eye contact as she tilted the heavy silver carafe and poured freshly brewed scalding black coffee directly onto my chest. She did not slip. She did not stumble. She simply decided my presence at the family brunch was an eyesore that needed to be erased. As the burning liquid soaked through my silk blazer, my sister pulled out her phone to record it, and my brother-in-law threw a $20 bill at me like I was a beggar off the street. They thought they were humiliating the family disappointment. They had no idea they had just declared war on the majority shareholder of the firm that owned their entire lives. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and before I tell you how I dismantled my toxic family piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off the very people who were supposed to protect you. Trust me, you will want to hear how this ends. The morning started like every other forced family gathering, dripping with fake pleasantries and suffocating expectations. We were sitting on the sunlit terrace of the Oakwood Country Club, an exclusive establishment that my mother Evelyn worshipped. For her, Oakwood was not just a place to eat eggs Benedict, it was a stage. She had spent the last decade aggressively social climbing through our church committees just to secure a membership here, desperate to project an image of generational wealth that we absolutely did not possess. I only agreed to come because my father had left 3 voicemails begging me to support my sister on her big day. The crystal chandeliers hummed gently above us. Waiters in pristine white vests glided silently between tables, filling heavy crystal goblets with iced water. The air smelled of expensive perfume, toasted brioche, and the dark roast coffee that was currently searing through my clothes and burning my skin. The pain was immediate and sharp. The hot liquid splashed across my collarbones, soaking instantly into the fabric of my custom-tailored cream blazer. I gasped instinctively, pushing my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. A few heads from the neighboring tables turned in our direction. In a place like Oakwood, a loud noise was the ultimate social sin. My mother did not gasp. She did not reach for a napkin to help me. Instead, she set the heavy silver carafe back onto the table with a soft, deliberate clink. She picked up her own pressed linen napkin, calmly patted her perfectly manicured fingers, and let out a long, dramatic sigh. She looked around at the staring patrons with an expression of performative embarrassment, shaking her head as if dealing with a rowdy toddler. "This is why we do not invite you to nice places, Kendra," she said, her voice sharp and steady, carrying just enough volume for the adjacent tables to hear. "You show up in cheap, off-the-rack rags and ruin Aaliyah and Preston's celebration. You have always been a clumsy embarrassment." I sat frozen, the hot coffee dripping from my lapel onto my skirt. My mother was rewriting reality in real time. She was the one holding the carafe. She was the one who leaned over my plate, angled her wrist, and let it pour. But in her mind and in the narrative she was currently broadcasting to the room, I was the chaotic burden who had somehow thrown myself into the path of her perfectly poured coffee. It was the same tactic she had used my entire life. If I got an A-, I was lazy. If I won a debate tournament, I was too aggressive and unladylike. Nothing I did ever fit the pristine, carefully curated mold she demanded. The irony was not lost on me. She called my clothes cheap rags because they did not have flashy, recognizable designer logos plastered across the chest. To Evelyn, wealth was a performance. If you could not read the brand name from 10 feet away, it was worthless. She had no idea that the blazer she had just ruined was a bespoke piece imported from Milan, costing more than her entire country club initiation fee. I did not need labels to prove my worth. I owned the supply chains that manufactured them. But I kept my mouth shut, breathing through the stinging heat on my chest. Across the table, my sister Aaliyah let out a high-pitched giggle. Aaliyah was 32, the undisputed golden child of the family. She had done everything our mother considered successful. She went to Howard University, joined the right sorority, landed a flashy job as a public relations executive, and spent her days curating an aesthetic lifestyle for her thousands of social media followers. She lived for the optics. Even now, instead of asking if I was burned, she already had her phone propped against her water glass, her thumb hovering over the screen. Beside her sat her husband, Preston. Preston was a 34-year-old white man who wore his privilege like a heavy, suffocating cologne. He was loud, aggressively mediocre, and constantly spoke over people who were smarter than him. Today was supposed to be his day. We were gathered to celebrate his recent promotion to vice president at a commercial real estate firm. My parents treated him like royalty, constantly praising his business acumen and fawning over his every word. Preston loved the adoration, and he especially loved having me around to use as a contrast to his own perceived greatness. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his mimosa. He looked at the dark stain spreading across my chest, then looked at my face, a slow, condescending smirk spreading across his lips. He chuckled, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out his designer leather wallet, fished out a crumpled $20 bill, and tossed it across the white tablecloth. The bill fluttered lightly before landing right next to my coffee-stained plate. "Go find a dry cleaner in your neighborhood," Kendra Preston said, his tone dripping with arrogant amusement. "Aaliyah and I are celebrating my promotion to VP. We do not need your dark cloud ruining the vibe." His words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Your neighborhood. It was a thinly veiled insult, an assumption that because I did not flash my money, I must still be living in a cramped apartment in a bad part of town, struggling to make ends meet. He assumed the $20 was an act of extreme charity. He assumed he was the most powerful person at the table. I shifted my gaze to my father, Reginald. He was the one who had begged me to come today. He was the one who promised that this time would be different, that we just needed to be a family and support each other. Reginald sat at the head of the table, a perfectly cooked filet mignon in front of him. As Preston insulted me, and as my mother glared at me with pure disdain, my father simply picked up his steak knife. He kept his eyes glued to his plate, meticulously cutting a piece of meat, chewing slowly, and taking a sip of his water. He chose his comfort over my dignity. He always did. The burning sensation on my skin was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. For 35 years I had absorbed their insults. I had played the role of the silent scapegoat, allowing them to project all their insecurities and failures onto me so they could feel better about their own hollow lives. I had built an empire in total secrecy, hiding my wealth and my power, because I foolishly believed that keeping myself small would eventually earn their love. But as I looked at the crumpled $20 bill resting beside my plate, I realized something fundamental. You cannot earn the love of people who fundamentally despise you, and you certainly do not owe them your protection. As if on cue to prove my point, Aaliyah reached into her designer handbag. She did not pull out a tissue or offer a napkin to help me dry my burning skin. She pulled out her phone. The sleek device had a built-in ring light case which she clicked on with a practiced flick of her thumbnail. The bright LED light washed over her perfectly contoured face. She checked her reflection in the screen, smoothed a stray blonde highlighted curl behind her ear, and tapped the screen to go live on Instagram. Instantly, her voice shifted. The shrill mocking tone she had used just seconds ago vanished, replaced by the buttery, fake sweet cadence she used for her thousands of followers. "Hey guys." Aaliyah purred into the camera, tilting her head to find her best angle. "We are just having a little family brunch to celebrate Preston making vice president. I am so proud of my hubby. But of course there is always that one relative who has to make everything about them." She flipped the camera lens around. The bright, harsh ring light pointed directly at me, illuminating the dark, spreading coffee stain on my chest, and the wet strands of hair clinging to my cheeks. I squinted against the glare, but I did not look away. "Look at her, y'all." Aaliyah laughed, panning the camera up and down my ruined blazer. 35 years old and still begging at the family table, spilling drinks on herself just to get a little attention. It is honestly just sad at this point. Oh my gosh, thank you for the heart emojis, Sarah. Yes, we are dealing with a lot of toxic energy today. Preston leaned into the frame, grinning like a frat boy who had just pulled off a prank. He wrapped an arm around Aaliyah's shoulder and waved at the camera, eager to play his part in my public humiliation. We even offered her $20 for dry cleaning. Preston chuckled, pointing to the crumpled bill resting on the white tablecloth. But you know how it is. Some people just thrive on the drama. They want to play the victim so bad. I did not look at the phone. I looked past the glare of the light straight into my father's eyes. Reginald was sitting less than 3 feet away from me. He had heard my mother's insult. He had seen her deliberately pour the scalding coffee over my plate and onto my body. He was currently listening to my sister broadcast my humiliation to the entire internet. He was the patriarch, the man who constantly preached about family unity, the man who had called me 3 times begging me to show up today because we needed to support Preston. My father carefully adjusted the pristine white napkin on his lap. He picked up his heavy silver steak knife in his right hand and his fork in his left. With excruciating precision, he sliced a small perfect square from the center of his medium-rare filet mignon. He raised the fork to his mouth, chewed thoughtfully, and reached for his crystal flute filled with orange juice and champagne. He took a slow, measured sip. He never once looked in my direction. He simply let the abuse happen just as he had done for my entire life, choosing the path of least resistance to protect his own peace. His silence in that moment was louder than Aaliyah's mockery. It was louder than Preston's arrogant laughter. It was the final confirmation I needed. The bridge connecting me to this family was not just burned. It was reduced to absolute ash. My mother sat back in her chair, a look of profound satisfaction settling over her features. She took a sip of her water, immensely pleased that her spontaneous act of cruelty was now being documented and celebrated by her favorite daughter. They were all waiting for my reaction. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to stand up and knock over a glass, to storm off in a dramatic, hysterical huff. That way they could spend the rest of the brunch shaking their heads, whispering to the waiters, and talking about how unstable and jealous I was. That was their favorite game. Push Kendra to the absolute edge and then punish her for falling over it. I refused to play their game. The burning sensation on my skin had faded into a dull, throbbing ache. The coffee was cooling, turning sticky and uncomfortable against my chest. I slowly placed both of my hands flat on the edge of the heavy wooden table. The chatter from the surrounding diners seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp, nervous energy radiating from my family. I stood up. I did not shove my chair back. I did not knock over my water glass or slam my hands down. I rose smoothly, my posture perfectly straight, my movements calculated and slow. The sudden controlled quietness caught them completely off guard. Aaliyah's phone wavered slightly in her hand. Preston's smug smirk faltered. My mother's eyes narrowed in suspicion. I reached over to the center of the table and picked up a clean-pressed linen napkin. With agonizing slowness, I dabbed the stray drops of coffee from my chin and my neck. I did not scrub at the stain on my jacket. I blotted my skin, treating the horrific moment with the calm, bored indifference of someone wiping away a bit of spilled water. I placed the stained napkin delicately beside my plate, folding it over once. Then I reached for the crumpled $20 bill Preston had thrown at me. Aaliyah zoomed the camera in on my hands, whispering loudly to her viewers. "Look, guys, she is actually taking the money. Unbelievable. She has no shame." I picked up the bill. The paper was worn and soft. I placed it between my fingers and smoothed out the creases, flattening it completely against the edge of the table. I held it for a brief second, letting Preston watch me. Then I leaned across the table. I invaded his personal space, bringing my face just inches from his. I could smell the expensive, overpowering cologne he bathed in. He stiffened instinctively, pulling back slightly, his frat boy bravado cracking under the heavy weight of my absolute silence. I placed the crisp $20 bill gently on top of his phone, which was resting near his plate. I patted the money once. It was a patronizing, dismissive gesture, the way you might pat a misbehaving dog. I looked deep into his eyes. I did not utter a single word. My expression was completely devoid of anger, sadness, or fear. It was a look of chilling, hollow emptiness. It was the look you give an insect right before you crush it under your shoe. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. The smugness completely drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. For the first time today, he looked unsure of his footing. I turned my gaze to my mother. She stared back, her jaw tight, still waiting for the outburst that would validate her cruelty. I simply gave her a small, polite nod, the kind of mechanical acknowledgement you give a stranger in an elevator. I did the exact same to my father, who had finally stopped chewing his steak and was watching me with wide, apprehensive eyes. I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not rush toward the exit. My heels clicked evenly and rhythmically against the polished marble floor of the country club. My shoulders were pulled back, my head held high. I could feel the eyes of the other wealthy patrons tracking my movement, taking in the ruined designer blazer and the absolute terrifying calm with which I carried it. I did not look back. I did not check to see if Aaliyah was still recording my retreat. I walked through the grand double doors of the dining room and stepped out into the crisp, cool morning air of the valet area. The silence I left behind at that table was heavy, toxic, and suffocating. They had wanted a victim, a hysterical scapegoat they could point their manicured fingers at. Instead, they had been met with a wall of solid ice. My refusal to react had robbed them of all their power, leaving them sitting in the uncomfortable, glaring reality of their own public ugliness. As I handed my ticket to the valet attendant, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an encrypted email alert from the chief financial officer at Vanguard Holdings. The final regulatory paperwork for the aggressive acquisition of Preston's commercial real estate firm had just cleared compliance. The company was officially mine. Every physical asset, every corporate contract, every employee, including him. I slid into the plush leather seat of my car, the engine purring to life as the doors automatically locked. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The coffee stain was ugly, a dark spreading mark against the pale cream fabric. But as I backed out of the Oakwood Country Club driveway, leaving my blood relatives behind, for the very last time, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. They wanted to treat me like absolute trash. Tomorrow morning, they were going to find out exactly what happens when the trash owns the entire landfill. By the time the sun set over the city, the digital wildfire had already consumed the internet. I was sitting quietly on the deep velvet sofa in the living room of my private residence, a glass of expensive red wine resting lightly in my hand. The quiet hum of the city far below my windows was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding on the glowing screen of my phone. Aaliyah had not just ended her Instagram live and moved on with her brunch. That would have been too simple. For someone like my sister, a moment of family cruelty was not a private event to be swept under the rug. It was highly monetizable content. She had saved the video, cropped it to focus heavily on my stained shirt, and my silent exit slapped a trending hip-hop instrumental over the background and cross-posted it to TikTok and X. The caption was carefully crafted to maximize engagement and position her as the ultimate victim. I read it aloud to the empty room. When your broke sister tries to ruin your husband's big day. #toxic family, #buy trash. When I first opened the application, the view counter was sitting at 2 million. By the time I refreshed the page a few minutes later, it had skyrocketed past 5 million views. It was a viral sensation fueled by the internet's insatiable appetite for real-life drama. At first glance, Aaliyah was getting exactly what she wanted. Her dedicated followers, a loyal army of aspiring influencers and gossip lovers, flooded the comment section. They praised Aaliyah for her grace under pressure. They hyped up Preston for his big promotion. They ruthlessly mocked my appearance, my silence, and my supposedly cheap clothing. But the internet is a massive, uncontrollable beast. When a video reaches an audience of 5 million people, it escapes the carefully curated echo chamber of a single influencer. It hits the mainstream algorithm, and the mainstream audience is entirely unpredictable. As I scrolled through the responses on X, I noticed the tide was already beginning to turn. People outside of Aaliyah's bubble were watching the video without her biased context, and they were noticing the glaring inconsistencies. A user with thousands of retweets pointed out the obvious. Why is the mother looking so smug while holding a carafe of hot coffee? Another user replied, "Wait, the mom poured burning coffee on her own daughter and the sister is filming it for clout. This whole table looks incredibly evil." The narrative was slipping out of Aaliyah's manicured hands. The public was no longer laughing at me. They were analyzing my mother. They were analyzing the cold, calculating look on Evelyn's face just moments after the coffee hit my chest. They were calling my mother a bully, a narcissist, and a sociopath. That was when my phone began to vibrate violently against the glass coffee table. It was the family group chat, ironically titled Family First. The notifications fired off in rapid succession, lighting up my lock screen like a strobe light. Aaliyah was panicking. Her brand dealt heavily in positive aesthetics and corporate sponsorships. Being tied to a viral video where the general public was accusing her family of physical abuse was a massive public relations liability. I unlocked the phone and watched the messages roll in. Aaliyah sent a screenshot of a viral tweet calling our mother abusive. Then came her text. "Kendra, you need to say something. My followers are turning on Mom. People are tagging my agency. Fix this right now." I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the rich flavor settle on my tongue. I did not type a single letter. A minute later, the patriarch of the family entered the digital battlefield. My father Reginald, who had sat in absolute silence slicing his filet mignon while my skin was actively burning, was suddenly full of righteous protective anger. Evelyn never got her own hands dirty in text messages. She always used my father as her personal enforcer, weeping to him behind closed doors so he would do her dirty work. His message popped up in a large, aggressive block of text. "Kendra, your mother is in tears. She is absolutely distressed by the horrific things these strangers are saying about her online. Aaliyah's followers are calling her mean and abusive. This is entirely your fault for storming out and making a scene instead of laughing it off like a normal family." I stared at the words, marveling at the Olympic-level mental gymnastics required to blame the person who was burned for the actions of the person holding the coffee pot. But Reginald was not finished. A second text pushed the first one up the screen. It was an ultimatum delivered with the heavy-handed authority he loved to wield over me. "Post a public apology video right now. You will look into the camera. Tell everyone it was a misunderstanding and admit that you provoked your mother. You will clear Evelyn and Aaliyah's names immediately. If you do not do this by tonight, you are officially out of this family. Do not contact us again." I rested my phone back onto the glass table. "You are out of this family." It was the ultimate threat in their arsenal. For years they had used the fear of abandonment to keep me in line. They believed that the greatest punishment they could ever inflict upon me was the withdrawal of their toxic conditional presence in my life. They genuinely thought I was a helpless, lonely woman who would crumble at the thought of being exiled from their Sunday brunches and holiday dinners. They did not realize that they were threatening a prisoner with the keys to the front gate. I leaned back into the velvet cushions and smiled. I was not going to post an apology video. I was not going to clear my mother's name. I was going to let the internet do exactly what the internet does best. I was going to let them dig their own graves in front of an audience of millions. I let the family group chat fester overnight. I did not block their numbers, nor did I turn off my phone. I simply muted the conversation, finished my glass of wine, and went to sleep enjoying the most peaceful 8 hours of rest I had experienced in my entire adult life. When you finally decide to stop carrying the weight of other people's toxic expectations, the silence that follows is incredibly sweet. The next morning, I stepped out of my private elevator and walked into my actual sanctuary. My corporate headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a shimmering glass skyscraper in the very heart of the financial district. My personal workspace was not a cramped, dimly lit cubicle or a shared desk in a chaotic bullpen. It was a sprawling glass-walled penthouse suite that offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of the city skyline. The floors were poured concrete, polished to a mirror shine, softening the strict modern lines of the custom mahogany furniture. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and fresh rain. This was the nerve center of Vanguard Holdings. This was where the real power lived. I walked over to my desk, set my leather briefcase down, and tapped the surface of my phone. Reginald had realized his demanding text messages from the previous night were being completely ignored. Unable to handle the lack of control, he had escalated his tactics. Sitting right there in the group chat was a 2-minute voice note from my father. I placed the phone in the center of my massive desk, pressed a button on my console to raise the motorized privacy shades overlooking the city, and tapped play. I let the audio run on speakerphone so his voice could echo freely through the cavernous space. Kendra. I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing. Reginald began, his voice heavy with performative exhaustion and self-righteous authority. We gave you everything. We provided a roof over your head, food on your table, and the exact same opportunities as your sister. But you chose to be difficult. You always chose to be difficult. You could not even finish your business degree the way we planned. You completely threw away your education to chase foolish pipe dreams, and now look at you. 35 years old, wearing cheap clothes, embarrassing your sister at a country club, and trying to tear this family apart out of pure jealousy. Fix this situation right now. The contrast between his words and my reality was so stark it was almost cinematic. My father was lecturing me about throwing away my education while his voice bounced off the soundproof glass of an office that generated more revenue in a single hour than he had earned in his entire lifetime. What he meant by throwing away my degree was that I had refused to follow his rigid, socially acceptable blueprint. When I was 22 years old, my parents had a very specific plan for me. I was supposed to attend a prestigious university, join my mother's legacy sorority, and immediately find a wealthy husband from a good family to secure my social standing. But the reality behind their grand plan was entirely hollow. Right around my junior year, I accidentally discovered a stack of past due notices hidden in my father's home office desk. I dug deeper and realized that Reginald was secretly drowning in massive, insurmountable bankruptcy debts. He was funding their country club lifestyle and Aaliyah's designer wardrobe on predatory credit lines. I realized then that if I followed their path, I would end up just as trapped and financially devastated as they were. So I stopped playing their game of pretend. I quietly transferred out of their expensive optics-driven university. I finished my degree online, working 80 hours a week from a tiny studio apartment to launch my first investment portfolio. I did not have time for sorority mixers or lavish brunches. I was too busy building the foundation of my company so I could secretly start paying off the second mortgage on their house before the bank foreclosed on it and humiliated them in front of their church friends. But because my success was not flashy, it did not count. Because I did not wear clothes plastered with giant recognizable logos, they assumed I was broke. Because I refused to brag about my financial milestones at the Thanksgiving dinner table, they labeled me a failure. They vastly preferred the comforting lie of Aaliyah's heavily filtered credit card-funded lifestyle over the quiet, brutal reality of my actual wealth. They wanted a scapegoat to project their own financial insecurities onto, and I had quietly absorbed their insults for over a decade just to keep the peace. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the city below. The cars on the highway looked like tiny, insignificant insects. I owned 3 of the commercial high-rises dotting the skyline to my left. Vanguard Holdings had spent the last 5 years aggressively acquiring the commercial real estate sector in this city. That portfolio included the exact building where Preston, my smug, cruel brother-in-law, was currently driving to fully expecting to be handed the keys to a new corner office. The voice note ended with a sharp, heavy click. My father demanded an apology, expecting me to grovel and beg for my place back at their table. He genuinely believed his words carried weight. I did not delete the audio message. I saved it to my encrypted private server. It was a perfect artifact of his delusion, a digital museum piece I would keep to remind myself exactly why I was burning this bridge down to the absolute bedrock. I was done being the financial life raft for a family that constantly tried to hold my head under the water. I turned back toward my desk, just as the thick glass door of my office swung open silently. The thick glass door of my office swung open silently. Chloe, my executive assistant, stepped into the expansive room. She was impeccably dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her demeanor a perfect reflection of the precise high-stakes environment she managed for me every single day. She moved across the polished concrete floor with quiet efficiency, carrying a single glossy publication in her hands. She did not say a word, completely respecting the focused atmosphere of the office. She simply walked over to my massive mahogany desk and placed the magazine precisely in the center, resting it right next to the phone that was still displaying my father's ridiculous, demanding ultimatum. She offered a brief professional nod and stepped back. I looked down. It was an advance copy of the brand new issue of Time magazine. The cover featured a high-contrast dramatic portrait of me. I was wearing a sharp, dark suit, my arms crossed, looking directly into the camera lens, with an expression of quiet, unyielding authority. The lighting highlighted the sharp angles of my face and the calm intensity in my eyes. Beneath the photograph, printed in bold, stark lettering that demanded absolute attention, was the headline, "The Silent Titan: How Kendra Washington Quietly Bought Up Corporate America." I let my fingertips trace the glossy letters of my own name. The timing of this delivery was almost poetic. Less than a minute ago, I was listening to Reginald call me a bitter, broke failure who had ruined her life and wasted her potential. My family was so deeply obsessed with the shallow illusion of success that they had completely missed the massive reality of my empire being built right under their noses. I had spent the last decade specializing in corporate restructuring. My firm Vanguard Holdings identified bloated, arrogant companies, acquired them aggressively, and completely dismantled their toxic leadership. I was a professional at tearing down failing structures, yet my family genuinely believed I was the weakest link at their country club brunch. Before I could fully process the delicious irony of the magazine cover, the office door opened again. This time, Jamal, my chief of public relations, strode into the room. Jamal was usually the calmest person in the building. He was a brilliant strategic mind who handled billion-dollar corporate crises and aggressive media storms without ever breaking a sweat. But today there was a tight, urgent energy radiating from him. He was clutching a sleek silver tablet, his eyes locked onto mine. "Kendra, we have a rapidly escalating situation," Jamal said, stopping squarely in front of my desk. He tapped the screen of his tablet and placed it down next to the magazine. "It is your sister. The video she recorded at the country club yesterday morning has officially crossed 7 million views across multiple platforms. The algorithm has pushed it completely out of her tightly controlled influencer bubble and into the mainstream digital feed. The general public is currently dissecting every single frame of that footage." I glanced down at the glowing screen of the tablet. The video was playing on a silent loop. I watched my mother tilt that heavy silver carafe. I watched the dark, scalding coffee splash onto my chest and soak into my tailored blazer. I watched myself stand up, smooth out the crumpled $20 bill, place it on the table, and walk away with absolute composure. "The legal team is standing by on high alert." Jamal continued, his tone purely professional and focused on rapid damage control. "Because she recorded you without your explicit consent in a private establishment, we have incredibly strong grounds to issue immediate cease and desist orders. We can have our tech contacts scrub the video from all major social media platforms within the hour. We can also release a carefully controlled corporate statement clarifying the situation, shutting down the toxic narrative, and protecting your image before this impacts Vanguard Holdings in any capacity." I looked from the tablet playing Aaliyah's cruel, mocking laughter to the Time magazine cover broadcasting my undeniable absolute power. Jamal and Chloe watched me silently waiting for the order to annihilate my sister's digital footprint. They had the vast resources and the aggressive legal team necessary to make that video disappear as if it had never existed. But making it disappear would mean stepping in to save my family from themselves. It would mean allowing my mother to retreat into the shadows and continue playing the flawless church society matron. It would mean letting my sister spin a brand new narrative on her page about how her powerful evil sibling used corporate lawyers to silence her. I had spent my entire life shielding them from the consequences of their own terrible financial and moral decisions. I was not going to protect them anymore. I reached over and tapped the screen of the tablet, pausing the video right on Aaliyah's smug, laughing face. Then I looked up at Jamal. A slow, cold smile spread across my lips. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. "Do not scrub it. Do not issue a single cease and desist order. I do not want our legal team anywhere near this situation." Jamal blinked, clearly surprised by the directive. "But Kendra, the comment sections are becoming incredibly volatile. Her followers are tagging your sister's public relations firm, and people outside her demographic are starting to piece together who you actually are. The financial bloggers are already making connections. If we do not step in and control the narrative right now, it will spiral completely out of her hands." "That is exactly the point, Jamal," I replied, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool glass surface of my desk. "My sister thrives on the illusion of control. She genuinely believes she can manipulate the internet the exact same way she manipulates our parents. But the internet does not belong to her. The public is already starting to see through the fake aesthetics. If we take the video down, we give her a reason to claim she is being oppressed. We give her an escape route." I picked up the advance copy of Time magazine and handed it to Chloe. "Have this framed for the main lobby," I instructed her. Then I turned my full attention back to my public relations chief. "Let the video trend, Jamal. Do not touch a single thing. Let the financial bloggers connect the dots. Let the watch experts identify the $250,000 Patek Philippe on the wrist of the woman they called broke. Let the entire world figure out exactly who they just poured hot coffee on. They desperately wanted an audience for their cruelty. We are going to give them the biggest, most ruthless audience they have ever had in their miserable lives. Let them dig their own graves. The internet operates with the ruthless efficiency of a global intelligence agency. Once a piece of content escapes the carefully manicured echo chamber of an influencer's core audience, it enters the wild, unpredictable arena of the mainstream algorithm." By noon that day, Aaliyah's video had crossed 10 million views. It had officially jumped platforms, migrating from the aesthetic-filtered world of Instagram directly into the unforgiving, hyper-analytical landscape of Black Twitter and TikTok. These were not Aaliyah's loyal followers. These were digital sleuths, cultural commentators, and thousands of everyday people who possessed an uncanny ability to dissect a 30-second video down to its microscopic psychological components. They did not care about Aaliyah's perfectly styled hair or the lavish country club background. They cared about the energy of the room. They cared about the receipts. And most importantly, they noticed the glaring, uncomfortable reality that my sister had completely failed to see. I sat back in my leather office chair and watched the narrative violently shift in real time. The first wave of viral pushback did not even focus on my identity. It focused entirely on the toxic dynamic my family had proudly broadcast to the world. A massive thread started trending, analyzing the microaggressions in the video. Users took screenshots of my mother's face just seconds after the scalding coffee hit my chest. They zoomed in on the chilling, deliberate smirk playing on Evelyn's lips. "This is not an accident," a prominent cultural critic tweeted to her 500,000 followers. "Look at the mother's eyes. She is satisfied. She did this on purpose, and the sister is filming it for content. This is textbook family abuse." Then the focus shifted to Preston. The internet tore into my brother-in-law with an absolute vengeance. They watched this arrogant, aggressively mediocre white man throw a crumpled $20 bill at a black woman while her own family laughed. They dissected his posture, his smug smile, and the sheer audacity of his insult. The optics were catastrophic for him. Aaliyah had framed the video as a celebration of his big promotion to vice president, but the public immediately labeled him a privileged, condescending villain. He thinks $20 is a flex. One viral comment read, "He looks like a guy who just maxed out his credit cards to buy a leased luxury car." But the true turning point, the moment that elevated the video from a viral family dispute into a massive digital mystery, happened exactly at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It started with a stitch on TikTok. The creator was a prominent luxury timepiece authenticator, a man whose entire platform was dedicated to exposing fake rich influencers and identifying rare high-end watches. His videos usually garnered millions of views because he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of stealth wealth. He did not care about flashy, logo-heavy designer clothes. He cared about the quiet, subtle markers of true, untouchable financial power. His video opened with his face framed right next to the paused footage of Aaliyah's original post. He was shaking his head, a look of profound amusement on his face. "Hold on a second, folks," the watch expert said, adjusting his microphone. "This influencer is crying on the internet, calling her sister broke, telling her to go find a cheap dry cleaner and throwing a $20 bill at her. But I need you all to pay very close attention to the sister they are making fun of. Watch her hands." He played the footage. It was the exact moment I stood up from the country club table. The camera showed me reaching for the clean linen napkin. As I lifted my arm to dab the spilled coffee from my collarbone, the sleeve of my bespoke cream blazer pulled back just a fraction of an inch. It was only visible for perhaps 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, the bright, harsh glare of the dining room chandelier caught the metallic face of the watch strapped to my left wrist. The expert paused the video right at that exact millisecond. He digitally zoomed in on my wrist, enhancing the resolution until the watch filled his side of the screen. The influencer sister is sitting there covered in mass-produced entry-level designer logos trying to look rich. The expert laughed, pointing his digital pen at the frozen image of my wrist. But the quiet sister, the one taking the insult without screaming, she is wearing a Patek Philippe Grand Complications. And not just any standard model. That is a highly specific custom piece. He pulled up a high-definition stock image of the exact watch I was wearing, displaying it next to the zoomed-in screenshot of my wrist. The internet collectively gasped. "For those of you who do not know luxury, let me educate you," the expert continued, leaning closer to his camera. "You cannot just walk into a boutique off the street and buy a Patek Philippe Grand Complications. You cannot just put it on a credit card. You have to have a massive purchasing history. You have to be invited by the brand." That piece of metal and sapphire crystal sitting on the supposedly broke sister's wrist is worth $250,000. $250,000. The expert was not finished. He was a master of contrast, and he knew exactly how to deliver a devastating punchline. He rewound Aaliyah's video and paused it again, this time zooming in on Preston's wrist as my brother-in-law proudly threw the $20 bill onto the table. "Now let us look at the vice president husband who thinks he is the king of the world," the expert said, his voice dripping with heavy sarcasm. "He is wearing a standard entry-level luxury watch, the kind of watch a guy buys on a financing plan when he gets his first middle management bonus. It retails for maybe $6,000. The broke sister could literally buy his entire life, his career, and his fragile ego with her left hand." He ended his video with a final chilling observation that sent the comment section into absolute overdrive. "I do not know who the quiet sister is," the expert concluded, staring directly into the lens. "But you see how calm she was. You see how she just looked at them and walked away. That is not the reaction of a broke person who is humiliated. That is the reaction of a boss who is about to ruin their entire lives. If I were the influencer and her husband, I would start updating my resume right now." The watch authenticator's video exploded. It hit 2 million views in less than an hour, then 5 million. It was shared across every single social media platform, bridging the gap between gossip pages, financial forums, and luxury lifestyle communities. Black Twitter took the breakdown and ran with it, turning my silent exit into a massive cultural meme. The quote tweets rolled in like an avalanche. She let them laugh at her while wearing a house on her wrist. The loudest people in the room are always the brokest. I need to know who this woman is immediately. She has supervillain energy, and I'm entirely here for it. The narrative had completely flipped. Aaliyah and Preston were no longer the stars of their own show. They had been reduced to the punchline of a massive internet-wide joke. The public recognized what my family was too arrogant and deeply insecure to see. My lack of flashy designer labels was not a sign of poverty. It was the ultimate flex of stealth wealth. I did not need to scream about my status because my status was woven into the very fabric of my existence. I sat in my penthouse office watching the digital fire spread closer and closer to my family's carefully constructed house of cards. They had wanted the world to see me as a failure. Instead, the world was actively hunting for my true identity, completely fascinated by the woman who wore $250,000 to a Sunday brunch and walked away from a fight she could have easily won. But the internet sleuths were only scratching the surface. A watch was just a piece of jewelry. It was a clue. It was not the entire puzzle. The real explosion was going to happen when someone finally connected the face in Aaliyah's viral video to the face currently sitting on the front cover of Time magazine. And based on the sheer velocity of the internet, I knew I would not have to wait very long. The watch expert was the initial spark, but the gasoline was poured at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. I was sitting at my desk quietly reviewing a quarterly earnings report when the digital landscape shifted from a mild tremor to a full-blown earthquake. The catalyst was a man named Julian Carter. Julian was a senior editor at a massive, globally recognized financial publication. He was a highly respected journalist who specialized in corporate mergers, acquisitions, and the quiet movements of venture capital. He possessed 2 million incredibly active followers, an audience composed of day traders, corporate executives, hedge fund managers, and financial analysts. He was also the exact man who had sat in my office 3 weeks ago to conduct the preliminary interview for my upcoming magazine feature. Julian did not browse social media for aesthetic influencer drama, but the algorithmic momentum of Aaliyah's video had pushed it so far up the trending charts that it landed squarely on his curated feed. He recognized me instantly. He did not hesitate, and he certainly did not mince his words. He quote-tweeted Aaliyah's original post, leaving her toxic hashtags completely intact for the entire world to see. His caption was brief, factual, and absolutely devastating. Is the broke sister you just poured coffee on Kendra Washington, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, the woman who just acquired half of the commercial real estate in the tri-state area? To ensure there was zero room for debate, Julian attached a digital preview of the brand new Time magazine cover directly below his text. The visual contrast was jarring. On the top half of the screen there was Aaliyah's blurry, chaotic footage showing me sitting at a country club covered in spilled coffee, being laughed at by my family. On the bottom half there was a high-definition portrait of me staring down the camera lens, officially recognized as one of the most powerful corporate titans in the country. When Julian hit send, the internet effectively broke. The tweet acted as a bridge between two massive, highly vocal online communities. The cultural commentators and pop culture sleuths collided directly with the ruthless, fact-driven financial sector. The velocity of the engagement was staggering. Retweets climbed by the thousands every single minute. The quote tweets became a relentless barrage of shock hilarity and absolute ruthlessness. Aaliyah's carefully curated comment section, which just hours ago had been filled with heart emojis and praise for her outfit, was instantly obliterated. Her loyal influencer friends went completely silent, terrified of catching the digital shrapnel. In their place came a tidal wave of public mockery. The internet turned on my sister with a ferocity that was almost beautiful to witness. The public had tolerated her arrogance when they thought she was simply punching down at a struggling relative. But the moment they realized she was punching up at a billionaire, Aaliyah went from looking like a glamorous victim to looking like an absolute clown. The comments shifted entirely, from my lack of designer logos to the embarrassing reality of Aaliyah and Preston's fake wealth. The internet loves nothing more than humbling people who desperately try to project a lifestyle they cannot afford. One viral tweet racked up 50,000 likes in 10 minutes. It read, "The influencer sister is out here bragging about a country club brunch while the woman she is mocking literally buys skyscrapers before breakfast." The secondhand embarrassment is actually making me physically ill. Another user dug into the brutal economics of the situation. Let us talk about the husband. He just got promoted to VP of a real estate firm. Right. Vanguard Holdings just spent the last 6 months aggressively buying out the commercial real estate market in that exact city. He threw a $20 bill at the woman who probably signs his paychecks. Preston quickly became the ultimate laughingstock of the platform. The image of a mediocre, arrogant white man tossing a crumpled $20 bill at a self-made black female billionaire resonated deeply with the public. It was the perfect visual representation of unearned confidence meeting actual untouchable power. People began zooming in on his outfit, tearing apart his perceived superiority piece by piece. That $20 bill is probably his entire remaining credit limit, someone joked. Look at the way his suit fits across the shoulders. That is an off-the-rack polyester blend. He is trying to flex on a woman wearing a custom Patek Philippe. Preston is about to be the most unemployed man in America by tomorrow morning. The mockery was surgical. Internet sleuths dissected Aaliyah's designer bags, pointing out which ones were from outdated outlet seasons and which ones were likely rented. They analyzed the background of her previous videos, noting the cheap fixtures and baseboards in the house she constantly pretended was a massive luxury mansion. Everything my sister had spent years trying to hide was violently dragged out into the harsh light of the public square. They were experiencing the very thing my mother feared most: total social humiliation. My family had spent my entire life obsessing over optics. They genuinely believed that looking wealthy was the exact same thing as being wealthy. They had bullied me, isolated me, and poured scalding coffee on me, all to protect a fragile, paper-thin illusion of superiority. Now that illusion was being shredded into tiny pieces by millions of strangers who saw right through their desperate performance. I sat back in my quiet, climate-controlled office, watching the notifications cascade across the silver tablet on my desk. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. When you build a house entirely out of lies and cruelty, you cannot complain when the wind finally blows it down. I had spent years quietly absorbing their abuse just to protect their delicate egos. I had paid off my father's secret bankruptcy debts while he called me a failure to my face. I had played the role of the quiet scapegoat because I thought it was the required price for keeping my family intact. Seeing my sister publicly exposed as a fraud did not break my heart. It freed me. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation simply snapped, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. I tapped the screen, closing the social media application. The internet had done its job perfectly. The narrative was completely out of Aaliyah's control, and the digital public had handed down their merciless verdict. But as entertaining as the online roasting was, it was still just words on a screen. My family was arrogant enough to believe that an internet scandal would eventually blow over. They probably thought they could lay low for a few days, post a highly edited apology video, and go right back to their pretentious country club lives as if nothing had happened. They had no idea that the real consequences were not happening on social media. The real consequences were waiting in the Human Resources Department of Preston's corporate office. Tomorrow was Monday, and the hurricane was just about to make landfall. The phone vibrated against the glass surface of my desk. It was not the steady rhythmic buzzing of a normal conversation. It was a frantic, continuous tremor. I looked down at the screen. The group chat, still ironically named Family First, was completely malfunctioning under the sheer volume of incoming messages. The tone had violently shifted. Just 12 hours ago, my father had issued a stern authoritative ultimatum, demanding I apologize to save my sister's reputation. Now the authority was entirely gone. It had been replaced by pure, unfiltered panic. Aaliyah was unraveling in real time. Her messages came through in a rapid barrage of fractured sentences, typos, and capital letters. The pristine, unbothered influencer facade had shattered the moment her professional life was dragged into the crossfire. Kendra, what is this guy talking about? Who is Julian Carter? Vanguard Holdings. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you do not own that company. People are tagging my public relations firm. My clients are in the comments. Kendra, my boss just emailed me. You need to fix this right now. Answer me. I watched the text bubbles appear one after another, painting a pathetic picture of a woman who had suddenly realized she was standing on a trapdoor she built herself. Aaliyah worked in public relations. She knew better than anyone how quickly a corporate brand would distance itself from an employee caught in a viral, mean-spirited scandal. Her firm relied on massive Fortune 500 contracts. The fact that her agency was being actively tagged by thousands of people calling her a toxic bully was a career death sentence. But what truly terrified her was the realization that the billionaire she had been mocking all morning was the exact type of corporate titan her PR firm desperately courted. Then came Preston. He did not text the group chat. He sent me a direct message. Kendra, please call me back. We need to talk about this Vanguard thing. Is that true? Are you the CEO? I almost laughed out loud at the screen. Preston's text was devoid of his usual frat boy arrogance. The crumpled $20 bill he had thrown at me was likely flashing before his eyes on an endless loop. He was finally doing the math. He was putting together the name of the holding company that had just aggressively acquired his commercial real estate firm with the name of the woman he had publicly humiliated 24 hours prior. He was a rat trapped in a maze, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. A few seconds later, my parents jumped into the fray. Reginald tried to regain control of his spiraling family, but his words lacked any real power. Kendra, pick up the phone immediately. We need to issue a joint family statement. This journalist is spreading lies about our financial situation, and it is making us look terrible. You need to call him and have that post taken down. Evelyn's text arrived right behind his, perfectly encapsulating her shallow, deeply narcissistic worldview. People from the Oakwood Country Club are sending me screenshots. They are calling your brother-in-law a broke fraud. Women from the church committee are asking me why you are on the cover of a magazine and why we said you were struggling. Kendra, you are embarrassing us. Fix this before Sunday service tomorrow. I sat back and observed the digital chaos. They were drowning and they expected me to throw them the life raft. For my entire life, that was my exact role in this family. I was the designated fixer. When my father was secretly drowning in bankruptcy, I quietly paid his debts. When my mother needed to maintain her illusion of generational wealth, I stayed in the shadows so she could funnel resources toward Aaliyah's flashy lifestyle. I had always absorbed their stress, their financial burdens, and their cruelty, asking for absolutely nothing in return. They genuinely believed I would do it again. They thought they could pour scalding coffee on me, mock me in front of millions of people, and then snap their fingers to make me clean up the mess when the world turned against them. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the private kitchenette situated in the corner of my penthouse suite. I ignored the vibrating phone. I reached into the sleek wooden cabinet and pulled out a bag of rare single-origin coffee beans. I measured them out with absolute precision, poured them into the grinder, and let the rich, earthy aroma fill the air. I prepared a pour-over coffee, watching the steaming hot water cascade smoothly over the dark grounds. It was a quiet, methodical ritual. I poured the perfectly brewed liquid into a heavy ceramic mug. I did not spill a single drop. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, weaponized coffee my mother had hurled at my chest the day before. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The flavor was bold, dark, and incredibly smooth. Holding the warm mug in one hand, I walked back to my desk and looked at my phone. The missed calls were piling up. Aaliyah had called 4 times. Preston had called twice. The group chat notification badge was sitting at 47 unread messages. They were begging for an interaction. They wanted me to scream, to argue, to gloat, or to negotiate. They needed me to engage with them because engagement would mean they still had a tether to me. It would mean they still existed in my world. I placed my coffee mug on a coaster. I picked up the phone. I did not open the messages. I did not read the frantic apologies or the desperate demands. I swiped down on the screen to open the control center. I tapped the small crescent moon icon, Do Not Disturb. The screen went completely dark. The relentless vibrating stopped instantly. The silence that fell over the massive glass-walled office was profound and absolute. Silence is the ultimate weapon against people who thrive on manipulation and control. When you argue with toxic family members, you give them ammunition. You give them a reaction they can twist and use against you to play the victim. If I had texted Aaliyah back, she would have screenshotted my response, stripped it of all context, and posted it to her followers to prove I was a vindictive, cruel sister. If I had answered my father's call, he would have spent an hour gaslighting me into believing I was the one destroying the family legacy. By giving them absolute silence, I gave them nothing to work with. I trapped them in a void. They were entirely alone with the devastating consequences of their own actions. They had to sit in their heavily mortgaged houses, staring at their phones, realizing that the bridge they had so gleefully burned was the only path to their survival. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the commercial high-rises I owned. The weekend was drawing to a close. Sunday service was approaching for my mother. But more importantly, Monday morning was just a few hours away. Aaliyah was going to have to walk into her public relations agency and face a board of directors who had just lost their biggest corporate contracts because of her vanity. And Preston was going to have to put on his cheap polyester blend suit, drive to his corporate office, and demand the corner suite he thought he had earned. They had spent the entire weekend living in a digital nightmare. They had no idea that the real-world execution had not even started yet. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity that always follows a weekend of absolute chaos. I did not need to be physically present in the commercial real estate firm to know exactly how Preston began his day. As the ultimate authority of Vanguard Holdings, I had unrestricted access to the building's high-definition security feeds, and my executive team provided me with real-time updates of the entire sequence of events. Watching Preston walk into his own execution was a masterclass in male delusion. Men like my brother-in-law possess a staggering, almost scientific ability to compartmentalize their own failures. While Aaliyah had spent the last 48 hours having a spectacular digital meltdown over the viral video, Preston had somehow convinced himself that the entire situation was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. In his mind, internet drama was not real life. It was just noise. Real life was the corporate ladder, and today was the day he officially reached the top rungs. Today was the day his promotion to vice president went into full effect. He had woken up, put on his best suit, which happened to be the exact same gray polyester blend the internet had ruthlessly mocked just yesterday, and fastened his entry-level luxury watch to his wrist. He drove his leased German sedan to the downtown corporate plaza, handed his keys to the valet, and walked through the revolving glass doors of the lobby with the swagger of a conquering king. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He had spent the weekend ignoring the financial journalists and the watch authenticators, convincing himself that the internet was simply making up wild rumors about my wealth. His ego was so massive and his deep-seated prejudice so ingrained that he literally could not comprehend a reality where the black woman he constantly belittled was actually a billionaire corporate titan. He thought he was walking into a corner suite. He had no idea he was walking into a slaughterhouse. The security footage showed Preston striding across the expansive marble lobby. He offered a condescending two-finger salute to the receptionist behind the main desk. Usually, she would offer a polite customer service smile in return. Today, she immediately dropped her gaze to her keyboard, completely avoiding eye contact. Preston did not notice the shift in her demeanor. He assumed she was simply intimidated by his newly minted executive status. He bypassed the general employee elevators and made his way directly to the private executive bank. This was the ultimate symbol of corporate arrival. He pulled his sleek corporate keycard from his leather wallet, adjusted his tie with his free hand, and slapped the card against the black security scanner. He stood back, waiting for the satisfying green beep and the smooth slide of the brass doors. A harsh, flat red light blinked back at him. The digital screen above the scanner read, "Access denied," in bright, unforgiving letters. Preston frowned. He looked around, suddenly aware that a group of junior analysts were standing nearby watching him. He wiped the magnetic strip of the card against his jacket lapel and swiped it again, pressing it harder against the plastic surface. The scanner beeped aggressively. The red light flashed twice. Access denied. His face immediately flushed with irritation. He let out a loud theatrical sigh, making sure the junior staff heard his annoyance. In his mind, this was not a catastrophic failure. It was simply the result of an incompetent information technology department failing to update his security clearance to reflect his new vice president title. He muttered something under his breath about having to do everything himself and marched away from the elevators, heading straight for the main security console. He leaned heavily against the polished marble counter, invading the personal space of the head security guard. Preston did not ask for assistance. He demanded it. He tapped his keycard impatiently against the stone surface, instructing the guard to manually override the system and grant him access to the top floor immediately. He cited his new promotion, raising his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding employees knew exactly how important he was. The head guard did not apologize. He did not type rapidly into his keyboard to fix the supposed error. He simply looked at Preston with a blank, unreadable expression, picked up his two-way radio, and spoke a few quiet words into the receiver. Less than 30 seconds later, two massive security personnel emerged from a side hallway. They were not wearing the standard lobby blazers. They were executive protection officers dressed in dark, tailored suits, moving with the quiet, intimidating efficiency of men who handled high-level corporate removals. They flanked Preston on either side. Preston actually smiled. His delusion was so absolute that he interpreted the arrival of two massive security guards as a VIP escort. He straightened his jacket, threw a smug look over his shoulder at the junior analysts who were still watching the bizarre scene unfold, and followed the guards away from the lobby. But they did not walk back toward the executive elevators. They led him down a narrow, sterile hallway located on the ground floor. The marble flooring quickly gave way to cheap commercial carpeting. The warm, ambient lighting of the main lobby was replaced by harsh, buzzing fluorescent tubes. Preston's smile began to falter as he realized they were walking directly into the administrative wing of the building. Specifically, they were walking into the Human Resources Department. The guards stopped in front of a heavy, solid wood door. There were no windows. There was no brass nameplate boasting a prestigious title. It was a bleak, soundproof interrogation room, used exclusively for severe corporate disciplinary actions and immediate terminations. One of the guards reached out, turned the handle, and pushed the door open, gesturing for Preston to step inside. Preston walked into the room, his chest puffed out, fully prepared to launch into a loud, aggressive complaint about the inconvenience of this detour. He opened his mouth to demand the presence of his immediate supervisor, but the words completely died in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, the blood instantly draining from his face. Sitting around the cheap laminate conference table were not his golfing buddies or his usual middle management supervisors. The room was occupied by the absolute highest tier of the company's leadership. The head of human resources sat at the center of the table, her hands folded neatly over a thick manila folder. To her left sat the chief legal counsel, and to her right were three senior members of the board of directors, men who usually only appeared for quarterly earnings reports or massive corporate mergers. None of them were smiling. The atmosphere in the windowless room was freezing thick with an unspoken terminal severity. But that was not what made Preston's stomach drop into a bottomless void. Mounted on the stark white wall directly behind the board members was a massive flat-screen television. It was powered on, and the screen was completely filled with a frozen high-definition frame of Aaliyah's viral video. It was paused exactly at the moment Preston threw the crumpled $20 bill onto the country club table. His own face, caught in a mid-laugh of pure condescending cruelty, stared back at him from the massive screen. The door clicked shut behind him, the heavy latch echoing loudly in the silent room. The security guards planted themselves firmly on the inside of the door, blocking the only exit. Preston stood completely frozen in the center of the room, his entry-level watch ticking loudly against his wrist. The protective bubble of his arrogance had finally burst, leaving him entirely exposed to the brutal corporate reality he was about to face. Preston blinked rapidly, his mind violently struggling to process the visual anomaly. He stared at the massive flat-screen television, looking at the paused image of his own face contorted in a mocking laugh, and then looked down at the grim, uncompromising expressions of the corporate executives sitting around the table. His survival instincts kicked in, but they were hopelessly entangled with his massive, blinding ego. He forced a stiff, awkward chuckle, desperately trying to project the calm, commanding confidence of a newly minted vice president. "I see someone in the Human Resources Department has a terrible sense of humor," Preston said, straightening his posture and adjusting his suit jacket. "If this little meeting is about my wife's social media accounts, I can assure you it is being handled. My sister-in-law is a deeply troubled, unemployed individual who thrives on creating family drama. It is a private, ridiculous matter that has absolutely zero bearing on my professional performance or my new executive title." The head of Human Resources, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman who did not suffer fools, did not smile. She did not offer him a polite nod of understanding. She opened the thick manila folder resting in front of her, carefully smoothing out a single sheet of paper. "Sit down, Preston," she instructed. Her voice was completely devoid of any warmth or professional courtesy. It was a cold, absolute command. Preston hesitated, his bravado wavering slightly under the sheer weight of her tone. He pulled out the cheap laminate chair and sat down, his entry-level luxury watch clinking loudly against the table. He tugged at his tie, a nervous tick he could not suppress. "Look, I understand that optics are important," he continued, his voice rising slightly in defense. "But my wife is a top-tier public relations professional. She is already controlling the online narrative. The internet loves to blow things out of proportion, but by tomorrow everyone will have moved on. I am fully prepared to step into my vice president role today and focus entirely on the upcoming quarter. Nothing about this situation is under your control." The head of Human Resources replied evenly, keeping her eyes locked directly on his. "And we are absolutely not here to discuss your wife's internet following or your excuses for your personal conduct. We are here to discuss a massive structural change regarding the ownership of this firm." Preston furrowed his brow, completely thrown off guard. The whiplash between seeing his own face on a disciplinary screen and suddenly discussing high-level corporate structure scrambled his thoughts. He leaned forward, desperately trying to put his business face back on. "Structural change." He repeated, his tone shifting to sound analytical and important. "I was just promoted on Friday afternoon. If there is a major reorganization happening at the board level, I should have been briefed alongside the other executives." The chief legal counsel, a silver-haired man sitting to the left, finally spoke. His voice was gravelly and strictly factual. "You were not briefed because your promotion was authorized by the previous ownership, Preston. As of Thursday evening, the final regulatory paperwork cleared compliance. This entire commercial real estate firm was fully acquired in a hostile takeover." Preston nodded slowly, his mind racing to catch up to the conversation. A takeover. That meant new leadership, new money, and new opportunities. His arrogance, which had been momentarily punctured, quickly began to reinflate. He saw this as a chance to prove his worth to the new bosses. He genuinely believed he was a vital asset. "I understand," Preston said, nodding smoothly, as if he were a seasoned industry veteran discussing a peer. "Acquisitions are a natural part of the corporate ecosystem. I am highly adaptable, and I am fully prepared to integrate my real estate department under the new umbrella. I look forward to meeting the new executive team and proving my value." Who is the parent company making the acquisition? Vanguard Holdings, the head of human resources, stated simply. The name hung in the cold, windowless room. Vanguard Holdings. It was the exact name his wife had been frantically texting him about all weekend. It was the name the financial journalists had plastered all over the internet, linking it to the viral video. But Preston's prejudice was a thick, impenetrable wall. He had spent his entire adult life looking down on my family, treating me as a pathetic, broke charity case. His brain literally refused to connect the monumental corporate titan that was Vanguard Holdings with the quiet black woman he had gleefully humiliated at a country club brunch. Vanguard, Preston repeated, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. Excellent firm, very aggressive portfolio. I am familiar with their recent acquisitions in the tri-state area. They buy out bloated companies and strip them down to their most profitable assets. I am exactly the kind of ruthless, forward-thinking vice president they need on their roster. The three board members exchanged a look of profound, silent disgust. They were looking at a man who was not only cruel, but breathtakingly stupid. He had dug his own grave, jumped inside, and was currently asking them to hand him a shovel so he could dig it a little deeper. The head of human resources picked up a small black remote from the table. You will not be meeting the new executive team, Preston. You have already met the founder and majority shareholder. In fact, you had brunch with her yesterday morning. She pointed the remote at the massive flat-screen television and pressed play. The frozen frame suddenly snapped to life. The volume was turned up high, filling the sterile, soundproof room with the crystal-clear audio of the country club terrace. Aaliyah's high-pitched, mocking laughter bounced off the walls. The video played the exact sequence of events, completely unedited. "Look at her, y'all," Aaliyah's voice chimed from the speakers. 35 years old and still begging at the family table. The board members did not look at the screen. They kept their eyes entirely locked on Preston, watching the exact moment his reality began to fracture. On the television, the recorded version of Preston leaned into the frame, grinning his arrogant frat boy smile. "We even offered her $20 for dry cleaning. But you know how it is. Some people just thrive on the drama." The high-definition video showed Preston tossing the crumpled $20 bill onto the white tablecloth. It showed the dark, scalding coffee soaking into my custom-tailored cream blazer. And then the video showed me standing up. It showed me calmly smoothing out the $20 bill, placing it gently next to his phone, and walking away with absolute terrifying composure. The head of human resources pressed the pause button right as my face filled the frame. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. "The woman you are mocking in this footage," the human resources director said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "The woman your family poured boiling coffee on, the woman you called a dark cloud, and the woman you threw a $20 bill at, is Kendra Washington." Preston stopped breathing. "She is the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings." She continued, driving every single syllable like a 6-inch nail directly into Preston's coffin. "She owns this building. She owns the operational budget that pays your salary. She owns the executive structure that mistakenly granted your promotion. She is, for all intents and purposes, the absolute owner of your entire professional life." Preston sat completely paralyzed in the laminate chair. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill, his skin taking on a sickening, ashen pallor. The aggressive, condescending swagger that had defined his entire personality evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His jaw went completely slack. His eyes darted wildly from the frozen image of my calm, powerful face on the television screen to the unyielding, merciless faces of the board members sitting across from him. He tried to speak, but his throat had completely closed up. A faint, pathetic gasp escaped his lips, sounding like a man who had just been violently punched in the stomach. His brain was finally catching up to reality, violently shattering the delusions he had harbored for years. The cheap clothes he always mocked were bespoke luxury. The silent retreat he always interpreted as weakness was actually the terrifying discipline of a corporate apex predator. The $20 he had thrown as a joke was hurled at a woman who could buy his entire bloodline with the spare change in her pocket. He looked down at his own hands, which were now trembling violently against the table. The room started to spin. He had not just made a social mistake. He had publicly humiliated a self-made billionaire who now held his entire existence in the palm of her hand, and she had just closed her fist. The head of human resources did not give Preston a single second to catch his breath or rebuild his shattered defenses. She pulled a thick, legally binding document from the manila folder and slid it precisely across the laminate table until it rested right in front of his trembling hands. The crisp white paper was a stark contrast to the dark, sickening reality closing in around him. "You and your wife publicly humiliated our majority shareholder," the HR director stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air of the windowless room like a scalpel. "You broadcasted that humiliation to millions of people across multiple social media platforms, directly attaching this firm's name and your new executive title to an act of blatant targeted cruelty." Preston stared blindly at the document. He tried to speak, but his voice was nothing more than a pathetic, dry rasp. I did not know. He managed to choke out, his eyes darting frantically toward the chief legal counsel. "I swear to you, I did not know she was the CEO. She never told us she had money. She always wore cheap clothes. If I had known who she was, I never would have said those things." The chief legal counsel let out a short, hollow laugh that contained absolutely no humor. "Do you actually hear yourself, Preston? Your legal defense is that you only abuse people when you think they are poor. You are openly admitting that you only humiliate women when you believe they lack the financial leverage to defend themselves. That is not a defense. That is a glaring admission of a severe character defect. And it is exactly the kind of catastrophic liability we do not tolerate at Vanguard Holdings." The HR director tapped her polished fingernail against the document on the table. "Section 4, Paragraph B of your new contract. The Executive Morality Clause. It strictly prohibits any public conduct that demonstrates bigotry, harassment, or brings severe reputational damage to the firm or its leadership. You did not just violate this clause, you completely obliterated it on a global stage." Preston's hands flew to his head, his fingers digging frantically into his perfectly styled hair. The reality of his financial situation was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He and Aaliyah lived entirely on credit. They had leveraged his expected vice president salary to qualify for the massive mortgage on their McMansion. They leased luxury cars they could not afford to project an image of wealth they did not possess. Without this job, his entire life was a house of cards sitting in a wind tunnel. He immediately abandoned all loyalty. He threw his own wife under the bus without a second thought. "It was Aaliyah." Preston stammered, his voice rising in high-pitched desperation. "It was my wife. She is the one who poured the coffee. She is the one who recorded the video and posted it online. I just went along with it so she would not get mad at me. She is a public relations agent. She is supposed to handle this kind of stuff. You cannot ruin my entire life because my wife made a terrible mistake. I am a top producer. I am a loyal company man. Please, you cannot do this. I just signed the paperwork for a new house. Your mortgage is not the concern of Vanguard Holdings," the HR director replied, her expression completely devoid of pity. "Your promotion to vice president is officially rescinded. Furthermore, you are terminated from this company effective immediately. You will receive no severance package. Your unvested stock options are entirely voided, and your corporate health insurance will expire at midnight tonight." No, Preston gasped, pushing his chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. No, wait. Just let me call her. Let me call Kendra. She is my sister-in-law. We are family. This is just a massive misunderstanding. Families fight all the time. If I just talk to her, I can fix this. She will tell you to stop this termination. Just let me call her right now. The three board members exchanged a brief, entirely unimpressed look. The chief legal counsel gave a slow, deliberate nod. You may call her, the HR director said, gesturing toward his phone. But you will put the call on speakerphone. The board of directors will bear witness to this interaction for the official termination record. Preston practically ripped his phone out of his suit pocket. His hands were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device onto the table. He unlocked the screen, pulled up my contact information, and pressed the call button, immediately tapping the speaker icon. He slammed the phone down onto the center of the table. Miles away, sitting in the absolute quiet of my glass-walled penthouse suite, I watched my personal phone light up on my mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed Preston's name. I let it ring. I let the agonizing electronic chime echo through his windowless interrogation room, once, twice, three times. I wanted him to sit in the suffocating tension, surrounded by the executives who were currently watching him degrade himself. On the fourth ring, I reached out and tapped the green button. I did not say hello. I simply let the line open. Kendra Preston practically screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with sheer panic. Kendra. Please, it is Preston. I am in the HR office. They are trying to fire me. They are trying to take everything away over a stupid internet video. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the sprawling city skyline. I kept my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion, projecting the terrifying calm of a corporate executioner. This is Kendra Washington, I said smoothly. Kendra, please stop doing this, Preston begged, completely abandoning whatever shreds of dignity he had left. Tell them it was just a joke. Tell them we were just messing around at brunch. I am so sorry about the $20. I am sorry about the coffee. I will pay for the dry cleaning. I will buy you a whole new wardrobe. Just tell them to let me keep my job. If I lose this salary, the bank will foreclose on our house. We will lose everything. Please, Kendra, we are family. The word family sounded absolutely repulsive coming from his mouth. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch across the line. In the HR room, the executives watched Preston hyperventilate, thoroughly disgusted by the pathetic display of the man who had acted so arrogant just 24 hours ago. You did not think about your house when you threw a crumpled $20 bill at me, Preston, I said, my voice echoing crystal clear through his speakerphone. You did not think about your career when you sat back and laughed while your wife poured boiling liquid onto my chest. You thought you were invincible because you believed I was powerless. I am sorry, I was stupid. I was just trying to show off. He sobbed, actual tears now welling in his eyes. I will do anything. Please do not do this to me. I picked up the heavy gold pen from my desk, turning it slowly between my fingers. You told me I was a dark cloud ruining your vibe, Preston, I reminded him, throwing his exact insult right back at his face. Yes, but I was wrong. I was so wrong, he pleaded. I thought I was a dark cloud too, Preston, I said, my tone dropping to a cold absolute zero. Turns out I am a hurricane. Pack your desk. I pressed the red button. The line went dead. The sharp final click echoed loudly through the HR conference room. Preston stared at his phone, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He had played his final card, used his ultimate lifeline, and I had effortlessly cut the rope. The HR director closed the manila folder with a loud, definitive smack. Your termination is final, she announced. Your personal belongings will be packed by a junior assistant and mailed to your home address. You are no longer permitted to access the executive floors, the corporate network, or any company property. She looked over at the two massive security guards standing by the door. Escort him out of the building. The guards stepped forward, grabbing Preston firmly by the arms of his cheap polyester suit. He did not fight them. All the fight had completely drained out of his body. His legs felt like lead as they pulled him up from the chair and marched him toward the door. They did not let him take the private executive elevator. They marched him straight down the main corridor, right past the glass-walled bullpen, where dozens of junior analysts and mid-level managers were hard at work. The entire floor went dead silent as they watched Preston, the man who had strutted through the lobby like a king just 30 minutes prior, being physically escorted out by executive protection. He kept his head down, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it made him nauseous. The receptionist at the front desk stood up holding out a small plastic bin. Without a word, the security guard forced Preston to drop his corporate keycard into the bin. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open and they pushed him out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. He stood there trembling, staring at the towering skyscraper that now belonged entirely to the woman he had treated like garbage. His career was over, his fake wealth was destroyed, and the hurricane had only just made landfall. Preston did not even make it to his least luxury car before he called my sister. I knew this because my security team monitored the exterior cameras, watching him pace frantically on the concrete sidewalk, holding his phone to his ear with trembling hands. I could only imagine the sheer hysteria echoing through the receiver when he told Aaliyah that the broke sister she had been mocking all weekend was actually the billionaire owner of his now former employer. The digital nightmare she had been battling on social media was no longer just an abstract problem about her follower count. It was a catastrophic real-world financial crisis. They had a massive mortgage, zero savings, and as of 5 minutes ago, absolutely zero income. Aaliyah was a public relations executive. Her entire career was built on the premise of controlling narratives, spinning disasters into opportunities, and manipulating public perception for high-paying corporate clients. When faced with the sudden terrifying collapse of her own life, she defaulted to the only survival mechanism she knew. She went into full crisis management mode. But watching my sister attempt public relations on herself was like watching a panicked amateur try to land a commercial airplane. She was so blinded by her own narcissism that she completely misread the room. 2 hours after Preston was escorted out of my building, a new video appeared on Aaliyah's social media channels. I was sitting at my desk eating a catered salad when my chief of public relations forwarded me the link. I tapped play, leaning back to watch the performance. Aaliyah had deployed the absolute most cliché textbook influencer apology setup in existence. Gone was the pristine, perfectly contoured makeup and the bright ring light. Gone was the designer outfit and the carefully curated aesthetic background of her luxury living room. She had intentionally positioned herself, sitting on the floor of her bedroom, specifically choosing a blank, unadorned wall to serve as her backdrop. She wanted to look small, grounded, and vulnerable. She was wearing an oversized, plain gray hoodie, and her hair was tied back in a messy bun. She had applied a specific digital filter to wash out her complexion, making her look pale, exhausted, and emotionally drained. She stared into the camera for a long, agonizing 5 seconds before speaking, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Hey guys," Aaliyah began, her voice trembling with a perfectly calibrated fake fragility. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this. I have spent the last 48 hours receiving thousands of hateful messages, death threats, and horrible accusations, all over a massive misunderstanding." She paused, bringing a hand up to wipe away an invisible tear from her cheek. The video from the country club was completely taken out of context. She continued, looking directly into the lens with wide, pleading eyes. "My sister Kendra and I have a very loud, sarcastic relationship. We have always played pranks on each other. That whole interaction with the coffee and the $20 bill was literally just an inside family joke. We were all laughing. Kendra was laughing. It is just our dark sense of humor. But the internet took a 10-second clip and twisted it to make my family look like monsters. I love my sister more than anything. I am just so heartbroken that people are bullying me and my husband over a private family joke. Please remember to be kind. You never know what someone is going through." The video ended. She had actually disabled the comments on the post itself, clearly hoping to deliver her fabricated narrative without allowing anyone to challenge her directly on her own page. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She did not apologize to me. She apologized to her audience for their misunderstanding of the situation. She completely erased the reality of the scalding hot coffee, the cruel insult from our mother, and my silent, dignified exit. She tried to rewrite history, painting herself as a loving sister who was now the tragic victim of a malicious cyberbullying mob. But Aaliyah severely underestimated the intelligence of the mainstream internet. You can manipulate an echo chamber of loyal fans, but you cannot manipulate a global audience of millions who have already seen the raw, unedited evidence. The backlash was instantaneous, and it was absolutely brutal. Because Aaliyah had turned off her comments, the public simply took the video screen, recorded it, and posted it everywhere else. The quote tweets and response videos flooded the platforms like a digital tsunami. The internet tore her apology apart frame by frame, completely destroying her fragile gray hoodie defense. One user posted a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the apology video where Aaliyah claimed we were all laughing. On the right was a zoomed-in screenshot of my face from the country club, showing my icy deadpan expression as the coffee soaked into my shirt. The caption simply read, "Show me exactly where the sister is laughing. I will wait." Another prominent commentator broke down the logistics of her lie. An inside family joke, the commentator laughed into her microphone. "Girl, we literally saw the steam rising off that coffee. We watched your mother pour boiling liquid onto a woman's chest and smirk like a Bond villain. What kind of family joke involves third-degree burns and throwing crumpled cash at people? You are not a victim. You are a terrible liar who just realized your husband is unemployed." The apology video was a catastrophic miscalculation. By attempting to insult the public's intelligence, Aaliyah poured gasoline directly onto the raging fire. She took the heat off Preston and placed it entirely back onto herself. And in doing so, she awakened a completely different demographic of the internet. The initial wave of viral outrage had been driven by strangers analyzing a 30-second clip, but Aaliyah's fake tearful victim act triggered a far more dangerous group of people. It triggered the people who actually knew her. There is a fundamental truth about chronic bullies and mean girls. They leave a long, highly documented trail of victims in their wake. Aaliyah had spent her entire life stepping on other people to elevate her own status, assuming that her pretty privilege and her corporate titles would always protect her from the consequences. She was wrong. The internet smelled blood in the water, and suddenly the floodgates of her past burst wide open. It started on Black Twitter. A woman who had lived in Aaliyah's dormitory during their freshman year at Howard University dropped the first massive receipt. "I have been waiting 10 years for this exact moment," the former classmate tweeted. "Aaliyah is sitting on the floor in a gray hoodie crying about being bullied. This is the exact same girl who used to run a secret group chat dedicated entirely to making fun of lower-income students on campus. She once publicly shamed a girl in the cafeteria for wearing off-brand sneakers until the girl literally transferred out of the school. She is not a victim. She has been a demon since 2009. The tweet attached 3 old grainy screenshots from a collegiate messaging board showing Aaliyah's username ruthlessly mocking other black women for their hair, their clothes, and their financial status. The post exploded, racking up 100,000 likes in an hour. Once the seal was broken, the avalanche could not be stopped. Former colleagues from her previous public relations jobs began dropping their own stories. A junior publicist posted a long, detailed thread explaining how Aaliyah used to steal pitch decks from younger employees, present them to the senior partners as her own work, and then deliberately sabotage the careers of anyone who tried to complain. Another woman posted an email screenshot proving Aaliyah had mocked a client's weight behind their back. The receipts were overwhelming. They painted a highly corroborated, devastating picture of a woman who was toxic down to her very core. She was not just a sister who made a bad joke at a brunch. She was a systemic, career-driven bully who had finally been dragged into the light. and the internet was making absolutely sure that her current employer saw every single piece of evidence. Users began mass tagging the elite public relations agency where Aaliyah worked. They flooded the agency's professional LinkedIn page with links to the Howard University screenshots and the stolen pitch deck emails. They tagged the massive corporate brands that Aaliyah's firm represented, asking them why they were doing business with an agency that employed an abusive pathological liar. Aaliyah thought she could put out the fire with a fake tear and a gray sweater. Instead, she had just invited the entire world to investigate her past, and they were methodically burning her entire professional reputation straight to the ground. While the internet was busy excavating my sister's deeply flawed character, I was preparing to dismantle the one thing she actually valued: her career. Social media outrage is a powerful tool, but it is ultimately just noise. It can embarrass a person, but it rarely forces them to change. To fundamentally alter the reality of someone who thrives on toxic entitlement, you have to hit them where they keep their power. For Aaliyah, that power resided entirely in her prestigious title as a senior executive at Sterling Communications. Sterling was an elite, high-pressure public relations firm that represented some of the most lucrative corporate brands in the country. Aaliyah used her position there as a weapon, constantly reminding our family of her elite corporate connections to justify her arrogant behavior. She genuinely believed her job made her untouchable. She was about to learn a brutal lesson about the corporate food chain. I pressed the silver intercom button on my massive mahogany desk and summoned my chief operating officer. Elias was a brilliant, ruthless strategist who managed the vast complex web of corporate contracts under the Vanguard umbrella. He walked into my penthouse office carrying a single crisp financial dossier. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He knew exactly why I had called him in. Sterling Communications. Elias said, placing the open folder directly in front of me. We ran a full audit of their client roster this morning. Vanguard Holdings does not employ them directly, but 3 of our largest subsidiaries rely on Sterling for their national media campaigns. Combined, those contracts account for roughly 30% of the agency's total annual billing. They are heavily dependent on our money to keep their lights on. I looked down at the financial breakdown. 30% of an agency's revenue was a staggering number. Losing that kind of capital overnight would send shockwaves through their entire executive board. Terminate them, I instructed, my voice flat and unwavering. Pull every single Vanguard-affiliated account from their roster effective immediately. Issue a formal notice of breach of contract. Cite the morality clause. Their senior executive publicly harassed our chief executive officer and brought severe reputational damage to our brand. We do not do business with liabilities. Elias offered a sharp professional nod. Consider it done. He picked up the folder, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office to make the phone calls that would detonate my sister's professional life. Across town, Aaliyah was walking into the sleek, modern lobby of Sterling Communications. I knew the exact layout of her morning because the public relations industry is a very small, highly communicative circle, and news of her spectacular downfall traveled through the executive grapevines faster than lightning. Aaliyah had spent the entire weekend crying on the internet and desperately trying to spin her fake apology video, but her delusion was so deeply rooted that she still believed her corporate title would protect her. She strutted past the reception desk carrying her designer iced coffee, her head held high. She expected her junior staff to grovel. She expected her coworkers to offer her sympathy for her traumatic cyberbullying ordeal. She was fully prepared to walk into the morning briefing and deliver a heavily rehearsed speech about overcoming digital adversity. But the office was dead silent. As she walked through the open concept bullpen, the usual hum of ringing phones and rapid typing was completely absent. Dozens of employees were standing at their desks staring at her. They were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with open, unadulterated disgust. The junior publicist she had notoriously tormented last year was standing near the printer, openly smirking as Aaliyah walked past. The internet had done its job. Everyone in the building had seen the Howard University screenshots. Everyone had read the leaked emails. They all knew exactly who she really was. Before Aaliyah could even reach her desk to set her bag down, her office phone began to ring. It was a direct internal line from the managing partner. Cynthia was a legendary, no-nonsense veteran of the public relations industry who had built Sterling Communications from the ground up. She was completely ruthless when it came to protecting her agency's reputation. Aaliyah was summoned immediately to Cynthia's massive glass-walled office located at the very center of the floor. Because the walls were completely transparent, every single person in the bullpen had a front-row seat to the execution. Aaliyah walked into the glass office and immediately launched into her practiced defense. Cynthia, she began forcing a confident, victimized smile. I know the internet is being incredibly difficult today, but I have already drafted a comprehensive crisis management strategy. The social media mob is just looking for a target, but I assure you my personal brand will bounce back. We can actually use this engagement to drive traffic to our upcoming campaigns. Cynthia did not look up from her computer monitor. She held up a single manicured hand, instantly silencing my sister. Sit down, Aaliyah. Cynthia commanded, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Aaliyah hesitated, her fake smile faltering as she lowered herself into the chair across from the massive desk. I do not care about your personal brand, Cynthia stated finally, shifting her piercing gaze to my sister. I care about my agency. For the last 2 hours, our corporate accounts have been flooded with thousands of messages demanding we terminate you. Our brand partners are threatening to walk away because they refuse to be associated with an executive who has a highly documented 10-year history of targeted harassment and bigotry. You have turned my prestigious firm into a digital laughingstock. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her panic rising. Cynthia, those receipts are totally taken out of context. It is a coordinated smear campaign. I can fix this. I am your top executive. You were my top executive. Cynthia corrected her, her voice dripping with venom. Until 10 minutes ago. Cynthia turned her monitor slightly so Aaliyah could see the screen. It displayed 3 urgent high-priority emails from Vanguard Holdings and its subsidiaries officially terminating all active contracts with Sterling Communications. We just lost 30% of our annual billing. Cynthia said, her voice rising in sheer anger. Millions of dollars completely evaporated in the span of a single phone call. The chief operating officer of Vanguard Holdings personally informed me that they are pulling every single account because you decided it would be a fun family joke to pour boiling coffee on their majority shareholder. Aaliyah's face drained of all color. The final devastating puzzle piece violently snapped into place. Preston had been right. The internet had been right. Vanguard Holdings was not a rumor. It was a reality, and it had just annihilated her entire career. But Aaliyah's arrogance was a terminal disease. Even backed into a corner, she tried to use her familial connection to save herself. Cynthia, wait! Aaliyah stammered, leaning over the desk in desperation. Vanguard Holdings, that is just my sister. Kendra is just acting out because she has always been jealous of me. She is throwing a tantrum. Just give me an hour. I will call my parents. I will have my father order her to reinstate the contracts. I can control her. Cynthia stared at her, completely flabbergasted by the sheer breathtaking stupidity of the statement. She looked at Aaliyah like she was looking at an alien species. Make her reinstate them, Cynthia repeated, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. Your sister is the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar holding company. She just dismantled 30% of my agency with a single phone call, and you think your father can order her around like a child. Cynthia stood up from her desk, towering over my sister. You work in public relations, and you failed to realize your own sister is a billionaire. You're a liability. Get out. The words echoed through the glass office, ringing with heavy terminal finality. Aaliyah sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for a response that simply did not exist. There was no spin room. There was no aesthetic filter she could apply to this disaster. Cynthia reached for her desk phone and pressed a button. Security, I need an escort to the executive floor. We have a terminated employee who needs to be removed from the premises immediately. 2 minutes later, building security arrived at the glass doors. Aaliyah was forced to stand up, her legs trembling violently. She was handed a standard cheap cardboard box and told to pack only her personal desk items under strict supervision. The entire bullpen watched in absolute silence as the golden child, the untouchable public relations queen, loaded a few framed photos and a coffee mug into a box. When she finally walked out of the glass office flanked by two massive security guards, no one looked away. The junior staff she had bullied for years watched her with quiet satisfaction. She had to take the walk of shame straight through the center of the office, carrying her cardboard box, her perfectly styled hair falling loosely around her pale, terrified face. The heavy wooden doors of the agency swung shut behind her, officially locking her out of the corporate elite forever. Aaliyah stood on the sun-baked pavement outside the Sterling Communications building, her manicured fingers digging into the sides of the cheap cardboard box, holding the remains of her career. For a normal person, being publicly fired and escorted out of a building by security would be a moment of profound self-reflection. It would be the rock bottom that forces someone to reevaluate their terrible life choices. But my sister was a narcissist, and narcissists do not possess the capacity for remorse. When their carefully constructed reality is destroyed, they do not feel guilt. They feel an overwhelming, blinding rage. She did not blame herself for the lost contracts. She did not blame her decade-long history of bullying other women. She blamed me. In her twisted mind, I was the villain who had maliciously plotted to ruin her perfect life, and she was determined to confront me and force me to fix it. She marched over to her leased luxury sport utility vehicle, threw the cardboard box into the passenger seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. She pulled out her phone and furiously typed the address I had given my parents 5 years ago. I had always told my family that I lived out in the northern hills of the city. Because they viewed me as a broke, struggling failure, they simply assumed I was renting a cramped basement apartment or sharing a cheap townhouse with multiple roommates. They had never once asked to visit me, and I had certainly never invited them. Aaliyah threw the car into drive and sped away from the downtown corporate plaza, her tires squealing against the asphalt. I watched her entire journey from the massive high-definition monitors mounted on the wall of my penthouse office. My private security team had tapped into the city traffic cameras, tracking her vehicle the moment she left the public relations agency. I knew exactly where she was heading, and I was fully prepared for her arrival. As Aaliyah drove further away from the city center, the scenery outside her window began to change. The crowded apartment complexes and strip malls gave way to winding, tree-lined roads and massive, sprawling properties hidden behind dense foliage. Aaliyah kept checking her navigation system, visibly confused by the affluent surroundings. She genuinely believed the digital map was making a mistake. She thought her broke sister could not possibly live in the wealthiest zip code in the entire state. Her vehicle finally rounded the last sweeping curve of the private canyon road. The automated voice of her navigation system announced that she had arrived at her destination. Aaliyah slammed on the brakes. She was not parked in front of a run-down apartment building. She was parked directly in front of a 12-foot-high, solid wrought iron gate, set into massive pillars of imported gray stone. The perimeter walls stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the dense, manicured forest. High-resolution security cameras were mounted on every pillar, their red lenses tracking her vehicle the moment it crossed the property line. It looked less like a residential home, and more like an impenetrable modern fortress. Aaliyah stared at the brass plaque mounted next to the security kiosk. It simply read Vanguard Estate. She rolled down her window, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and boiling anger. She leaned out and aggressively honked her horn, expecting the gates to magically part for her. Instead, the tinted glass door of the security kiosk slid open. A towering executive protection officer stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, a communication earpiece resting discreetly in his ear. He walked up to the driver's side window of her vehicle, completely unbothered by her aggressive honking. He did not smile. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting an aura of absolute authority. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The guard asked, his voice calm and professional. Aaliyah glared at him immediately, defaulting to her condescending elite persona. I am here to see Kendra Washington. Open the gate. I know she rents a guest house or a basement unit somewhere on this property. The guard looked down at a digital tablet he was holding. He swiped the screen once. Ms. Washington is the sole owner of this 50-acre estate, he corrected her, his tone perfectly flat. There are no renters on this property. Furthermore, Ms. Washington is currently at her corporate headquarters in the city, and she has explicitly placed you on a restricted access list. You are trespassing on private property. I need you to turn your vehicle around and leave immediately. The words hit Aaliyah like a physical blow to the face. The sole owner of a 50-acre estate. The reality of my wealth, which had only been an abstract concept when she read about it on the internet, was suddenly a massive 12-foot-high iron wall blocking her path. The sister she had mocked for wearing off-the-rack clothing lived behind gates guarded by men in tailored suits. Her fragile ego completely snapped. Aaliyah threw her car into park, shoved her door open, and stepped out onto the pristine driveway. She completely abandoned any lingering shred of dignity. She marched right past the security guard, ignoring his direct commands to stop, and threw herself against the heavy wrought iron gates. She grabbed the metal bars with both hands and began to shake them violently, her knuckles turning white. Open the gate, she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek. She owes me. I am her sister. You cannot lock me out. Kendra, answer me right now. She began kicking the solid iron, her designer shoes scraping uselessly against the heavy metal. She looked completely unhinged. She was still wearing the oversized gray hoodie from her fake apology video, her hair falling out of its messy bun, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. She was banging her fists against the gate, weeping and screaming my name into the empty canyon, demanding that I fix the shattered remains of her life. The security guard did not touch her. He simply stepped back, tapped his earpiece, and spoke a few quiet words to the local police department dispatcher, requesting a squad car for an active trespasser. But the police were not the ones who arrived first. The sound of screeching tires echoed down the canyon road. Two unmarked black sedans aggressively pulled up right behind Aaliyah's parked vehicle. The doors flew open and 4 people jumped out. They were not police officers. They were holding heavy professional-grade cameras with massive telephoto lenses. They were local paparazzi, and they had been tipped off by the very junior publicists Aaliyah had tormented at her former agency. When Aaliyah left the office in disgrace, her co-workers knew exactly what she would do next. They knew she would drive straight to my house to throw a tantrum, and they gladly handed my address over to the tabloids to ensure her final downfall was permanently documented. The flashbulbs erupted like a violent lightning storm. Aaliyah froze, her hands still gripping the iron bars of my gate. The sudden blinding flashes of light illuminated her tear-streaked face and her pathetic, hysterical posture. The paparazzi shouted her name, asking rapid-fire questions about her termination, her viral bullying video, and the fake apology she had posted just hours ago. Aaliyah, is it true you just got fired from Sterling Communications? Aaliyah, how does it feel to know your broke sister owns a 50-acre estate while you are facing foreclosure? Aaliyah, look over here. She let go of the gate, stumbling backward as the cameras continued to flash relentlessly. The woman who had spent her entire life desperately chasing the spotlight was suddenly terrified of the glare. She threw her hands up, trying to shield her face from the lenses, but there was nowhere to hide. The photographers had completely surrounded her vehicle, capturing hundreds of high-definition images of her absolute rock bottom. "Stop it!" she shrieked, tears of pure humiliation streaming down her face. "Stop taking pictures of me! Leave me alone!" She scrambled back toward her vehicle, nearly tripping over her own feet in her desperation to escape. She yanked the car door open, threw herself into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. She threw her coat over her head to block out the flashing lights as she slammed the car into reverse. The paparazzi smoothly stepped out of the way, continuing to snap photos as she wildly backed her car down the canyon road, nearly swiping a stone retaining wall before peeling away into the distance. I watched her taillights disappear from the security monitors, the red glow fading into the shadows of the trees. She had driven up to my gates hoping to bully me into saving her. Instead, she had delivered the final, most humiliating act of her own destruction straight to the tabloids. The golden child was gone. All that remained was a viral cautionary tale. The absolute destruction of my sister's career and her humiliating tabloid meltdown at my front gates should have been the final warning for my parents to simply walk away. But toxic families do not operate on logic or self-preservation. They operate on a desperate, relentless need for control. When the golden child fell from grace, the enablers had to step in. They had to try and force the scapegoat back into her designated cage. 48 hours after Aaliyah's viral public relations disaster, I was sitting at my usual table inside the reserve. It was an ultra-exclusive members-only coffee house located in the heart of the financial district, requiring a rigorous vetting process and a massive annual fee just to walk through the front door. I came here every Wednesday morning to review my international portfolio in absolute peace. The lighting was low, the leather booths were private, and the only sound was the soft hum of jazz and the quiet clinking of ceramic espresso cups. I was halfway through a quarterly earnings report when the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the lounge swung open. The maitre d' stepped forward to intercept the intruders, but they simply pushed past him, their eyes frantically scanning the room. It was Evelyn and Reginald. My mother was dressed in her absolute Sunday best. She wore a tailored navy blue dress and her signature pearl necklace clutching a designer handbag like a shield. Her face was heavily powdered to hide the dark circles under her eyes, but the frantic, chaotic energy radiating from her could not be concealed. Right behind her was my father. Reginald looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of 3 days. His shoulders were slumped, his suit jacket was slightly wrinkled, and he kept glancing around the opulent room with a mixture of intimidation and deep resentment. They had clearly harassed my executive assistant for my location, likely threatening to cause a scene at the corporate headquarters if she did not tell them where I was. Evelyn spotted me sitting in the corner booth. She marched across the polished hardwood floor, her heels clicking loudly against the quiet atmosphere of the room. A few powerful executives at the neighboring tables looked up irritated by the sudden disruption. Evelyn did not care. She reached my table and immediately threw herself into the plush leather seat across from me. Reginald slid into the booth next to her, keeping his eyes fixed entirely on his hands. "Kendra," my mother gasped, her voice trembling as she instantly deployed her most powerful weapon. The fake devastated tears. She pressed a manicured hand to her chest, taking a sharp, ragged breath to ensure anyone sitting nearby could hear her profound suffering. "How could you do this to us? How could you do this to your sister? Aaliyah is practically catatonic in her bedroom. She lost her job. Preston lost his promotion. They are going to lose their house. We are your family, Kendra. Family over absolutely everything." I did not close my financial report. I simply looked up at her, my face completely devoid of sympathy. "You poured boiling coffee on my chest, Evelyn. Do not sit here and preach to me about family over everything." She waved her hand dismissively, actively rewriting history to suit her victim narrative. "That was an accident. You know I have a bad wrist. You stormed out and let the internet turn a simple family misunderstanding into a global witch hunt. But I am willing to forgive you for that. I am willing to look past the disrespect if you just fix this. You have to call Aaliyah's boss and give them their contracts back." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I am not giving anyone anything. Aaliyah was fired because she is a liability. Preston was fired because he violated his morality clause. Actions have consequences. Welcome to the real world. Evelyn's fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a flash of desperate anger. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper. "You have always been so bitter. You have always held a grudge because you thought we favored your sister. But you do not understand the sacrifices we made. We did our best, Kendra. We paid for Aaliyah's tuition at Howard University because she had the potential to do something great with her life. We drained our savings to give her that start. We did not have enough left over for you, but we loved you both equally. You cannot punish us for being poor. You cannot destroy your sister's life just because we could not afford to send you to a fancy school." She sat back looking incredibly satisfied with her own speech. She genuinely believed she had just delivered a bulletproof defense. She was playing the role of the tragic loving mother who had simply done her best with limited resources, hoping to guilt me into submission by invoking the heavy burden of her financial sacrifices. I placed my ceramic cup down on the saucer. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the seat beside me. I did not pull out my phone or my tablet. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. I unclasped the metal fastener, pulled out a stack of heavily redacted bank statements and certified wire transfer confirmations, and laid them completely flat on the center of the table. "No, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying absolute calm. "You did not pay for Aaliyah's tuition." "I did." Evelyn froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Beside her, Reginald physically recoiled. His head snapped up, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he looked at the documents resting on the table. He recognized the letterhead of the bank immediately. I tapped my index finger against the top document. When I was 26 years old, I found a stack of final foreclosure notices hidden in the bottom drawer of Dad's home office desk. I found the collection letters. I found the predatory loan agreements he signed just so you could keep paying your country club dues and buying designer handbags. I discovered that this family was exactly 30 days away from complete financial annihilation and total public bankruptcy. I slid the first wire transfer receipt across the table, pushing it directly in front of my father. Reginald stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. I had just secured my first major round of venture capital funding. I continued maintaining direct, unyielding eye contact with my father. Instead of celebrating, I quietly funneled those profits into a blind trust. "I set up an anonymous limited liability company, and I bought your second mortgage directly from the bank. I paid off your credit card debts. And every single semester, I wired the exact amount of Aaliyah's tuition directly to the bursar's office at Howard University under a completely anonymous scholarship grant." Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at her husband. "Reginald," she stammered, her voice shaking with genuine shock. "Reginald, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying. We paid for that school. We paid for this lifestyle." Reginald could not look at his wife. His face had turned a sickening shade of gray. He slumped back against the leather booth, looking like a man who had just been publicly executed. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly made. Evelyn's carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces right there in the coffee house. The grand illusion she had built her entire identity around was completely fake. The generational wealth she bragged about at church did not exist. The tuition she claimed as a parental sacrifice was paid by the very daughter she constantly berated. "You chose to believe I was a broke failure because it fit your narrative," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of her delusions. "You needed a scapegoat so you could feel superior. It was easier for you to look down on my cheap clothes than it was to face the reality that your entire existence was being subsidized by the child you threw away. You lived in a house I saved, wearing clothes bought with credit I cleared, cheering for a golden child whose education I entirely funded." Evelyn was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as she desperately tried to grasp at any remaining shred of her superiority. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. "You are a monster!" Evelyn hissed, tears of pure humiliation finally spilling over her eyelashes. "You sat there for 10 years and let us believe we were providing for this family, while you secretly held this over our heads. You are an ungrateful, wicked child. God sees exactly what you are doing. You can flash your little bank statements all you want, but you will never have the respect of the community. You will never have the grace of our church. Money cannot buy you moral superiority, Kendra." She played her final desperate card. She retreated to the safety of her megachurch, the one place where she was still a revered, high-standing society matron. She believed her position on the church outreach committee made her untouchable. I smiled. It was a cold, surgical expression. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the freshly printed copy of Time magazine. I slid the glossy publication across the table, letting it cover the bank statements. The bold headline, "The Silent Titan," glared up at them. My face stared back from the cover, radiating the exact type of untouchable power Evelyn had spent her entire life faking. Reginald let out a soft, defeated groan. Evelyn stared at the magazine, her eyes darting frantically across the text. But I was not finished. The magazine was just a prop. The real execution was completely invisible. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table, bringing my face inches away from my mother's terrified expression. "Speaking of the church," I said smoothly. Vanguard Holdings recently acquired a massive portfolio of commercial real estate debt from a failing regional bank. Included in that portfolio was the multi-million-dollar construction loan for your megachurch's brand-new recreation center. As the sole owner of that debt, I hold massive leverage over the financial operations of the congregation. Evelyn stopped breathing. The color completely drained from her heavily powdered face. Yesterday afternoon, I instructed my corporate legal team to enforce a covenant in that loan agreement. I continued, lowering my voice so only they could hear the absolute destruction in my words. I demanded a full forensic audit of the church's community outreach funds. Every single ledger, every single donation, every single withdrawal. No. Evelyn gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, you cannot do that." "I already did," I replied instantly. And it turns out forensic accountants are incredibly fast when they are highly motivated. They found the discrepancies within 4 hours. "I know you have been skimming from the offering plates, Evelyn. I know you have been diverting thousands of dollars from the charity drives directly into a private account to pay your Oakwood Country Club monthly dues." Reginald whipped his head around, staring at his wife in sheer disbelief. "Evelyn, what did you do?" he hissed, his voice cracking with panic. "She did what she always does," I answered for her. "She lied to maintain her optics. But you cannot gaslight an audit, Mother." The preliminary findings have already been handed over to the church's board of directors. The audit goes completely public tomorrow morning. By noon, every single person in your congregation, every woman on your society committee, and every patron at the country club will know that you are nothing but a common thief who steals from the church to buy expensive brunches. Evelyn was completely paralyzed. The arrogant, condescending woman who had poured boiling coffee on my chest just a few days ago was entirely gone. She was nothing but a terrified hollow shell staring at the total annihilation of her social standing, her marriage, and her freedom. I picked up my ceramic cup and took one final sip of my coffee. I stood up from the booth, smoothing out the front of my designer blazer. I looked down at the two people who had made my life a living hell for 35 years. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money was gone. Their golden child was ruined. Their secrets were exposed. I picked up my briefcase and turned to walk away. I stopped for a fraction of a second, looking back at my mother over my shoulder. "Good luck at Sunday service," I said. I walked out of the coffee house, stepping into the bright, warm sunlight of the city I owned, leaving them sitting in the dark shadow of their own making. The speed at which a life built entirely on credit and lies can collapse is truly something to behold. When you remove the fragile scaffolding of fake wealth and social pretense, the resulting crash is absolutely deafening. I did not have to lift another finger to destroy my family. I simply stopped being their financial shield, stepped out of the way, and let gravity do the rest. The financial dominoes began to fall the very next morning, and they fell with brutal mechanical efficiency. Preston and Aaliyah were the first to hit the ground. They woke up on Tuesday morning completely unemployed, universally despised by the internet, and entirely devoid of any financial safety net. Aaliyah tried to leverage her remaining industry contacts, desperately emailing rival public relations firms, begging for a consultation position. But the corporate world is incredibly small, and nobody wanted to hire a woman who was currently the subject of a massive viral bullying scandal. She was radioactive. Her emails went unanswered. Her calls were sent straight to voicemail. Preston fared even worse. The commercial real estate sector is built heavily on reputation and relationships. The video of him arrogantly throwing a crumpled $20 bill at the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings had circulated through every major brokerage and investment firm in the city. He was not just fired, he was permanently blacklisted. When he tried to submit his resume to smaller regional agencies, he was laughed out of the lobby before he could even reach the reception desk. He had become the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate arrogance. By the end of the first week, the absolute reality of their heavily leveraged lifestyle caught up with them. They lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom McMansion in a gated suburban neighborhood, a house they had secured using aggressive variable rate mortgages based on Preston's anticipated executive salary. Without that income, the massive monthly payment was impossible to meet. Within 30 days, the bank issued their first notice of default. The repossession agents arrived a few days later. It happened in broad daylight right in front of their wealthy, judgmental neighbors. 2 heavy-duty tow trucks backed into their pristine driveway and hooked up Aaliyah's luxury sport utility vehicle and Preston's leased German sedan. Aaliyah stood on her manicured front lawn, screaming at the tow truck drivers, while Preston furiously paced the sidewalk, yelling at his wife to stop making a scene. That was the moment their marriage completely fractured. Their relationship was never built on mutual respect or genuine love. It was a corporate merger built entirely on optics, aesthetics, social media posts, and the shared enjoyment of looking down on other people. The moment the money evaporated, they turned on each other like starving wolves. Preston blamed Aaliyah for recording the video and ruining his career. Aaliyah blamed Preston for being a mediocre provider who could not secure a new job. They were trapped in a rapidly emptying house surrounded by moving boxes screaming at each other while the bank prepared the final foreclosure paperwork. My parents met a different but equally devastating fate. Evelyn's entire identity was anchored to her perceived status as a pillar of high society and the moral authority of her megachurch. She genuinely believed that if she just showed up to Sunday service wearing her best designer dress, she could smile her way through the scandal. She underestimated the sheer brutal velocity of a forensic financial audit. By the time Evelyn walked through the heavy wooden doors of the church sanctuary that Sunday, the audit had already been leaked to the entire congregation. The whispers started the moment her high heels clicked against the marble foyer. The women she had spent years gossiping with, the very same women she had desperately tried to impress, actively turned their backs on her as she walked down the aisle. The head pastor did not even let her reach her usual front row pew. He intercepted her in the center aisle accompanied by 2 members of the church board. In front of hundreds of onlookers, he quietly but firmly informed Evelyn that she was officially stripped of her position on the Community Outreach Committee. She was asked to step down from all church activities immediately pending a criminal investigation into the thousands of dollars she had systematically diverted from the charity funds to pay for her luxury lifestyle. Evelyn fled the sanctuary in tears, her reputation permanently incinerated. She could never show her face in that community again. Reginald was completely alienated from his pretentious social circles the very next day. When news of Evelyn's embezzlement spread to the Oakwood Country Club, the membership board immediately audited Reginald's account. They discovered that his monthly dues had been bouncing for weeks. Without my silent, anonymous financial backing, Reginald had absolutely no way to maintain his affluent facade. The club terminated their membership with a cold, formal letter, permanently locking them out of the only social arena they actually cared about. My parents were left entirely alone in a house that I technically owned. I did not evict them. Kicking them out into the street would have been a momentary punishment. Leaving them trapped inside those walls was a lifelong sentence. They were forced to sit across from each other at the dinner table every single night, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their golden child. They had no one left to blame but themselves, and no one left to project their bitter insecurities onto. They were condemned to spend the rest of their lives suffocating in each other's toxic company. 3 months later, the dust had completely settled. The viral internet storm had moved on to a new target, leaving my family in the permanent ruins of their own making. I, on the other hand, was exactly where I belonged. It was a beautiful, crisp Sunday morning. The sun was shining brightly over the manicured green lawns of the Oakwood Country Club. The crystal chandeliers in the main dining room hummed gently overhead, casting a warm, expensive glow over the white tablecloths and heavy silver cutlery. The air smelled of toasted brioche and fresh, dark roast coffee. It was the exact same terrace, the exact same time of day, and the exact same atmosphere as the morning my mother had poured boiling liquid onto my chest. But the dynamic in the room had shifted on a monumental scale. I was not wearing a dark, coffee-stained blazer. I was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored white suit. The fabric was immaculate, glowing brightly in the morning sun, symbolizing an absolute, untouchable fresh start. I was not sitting with people who viewed me as a dark cloud. I was sitting at the best table on the terrace, surrounded by my chosen family. Jamal, my brilliant chief of public relations, was sitting to my right, laughing loudly at a joke. Chloe, my executive assistant, was sitting across from me, sipping a mimosa and reviewing a digital portfolio. Elias, my ruthless chief operating officer, was leaning back in his leather chair, looking completely relaxed. These were the people who had stood by me as I built my empire from the ground up. They did not care about my compliance or my ability to play a subservient role. They valued my intellect, my drive, and my unwavering loyalty. We had forged our bond in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, proving time and time again that true family is not determined by shared bloodlines. True family is determined by the people who consistently show up to protect your peace. As we finished our brunch, the general manager of the country club approached our table. He was a distinguished older gentleman who had worked at Oakwood for 20 years. 3 months ago, he had stood in the corner of this very room and watched Preston throw a $20 bill at me, doing absolutely nothing to intervene. Today, his posture was entirely different. He stopped a respectful distance from the table, clasping his hands together and bowing his head slightly. "Excuse me for interrupting your morning, Ms. Washington," the manager said, his voice dripping with utmost deference and nervous respect. "I just wanted to personally ensure that everything is to your liking today. The kitchen prepared your coffee exactly to your specifications." "It is perfect, thank you," I replied smoothly, offering him a polite, dismissive smile. "We are incredibly honored to have you dining with us today," he continued, shifting his weight slightly. "And I wanted to formally thank you again on behalf of the entire staff for acquiring the club. We are very excited about the new direction Vanguard Holdings will be taking this establishment." I gave him a slow, measured nod. "Just ensure the membership roster remains strictly curated. We only want people who actually respect the environment they are in." "Absolutely, Ms. Washington. Consider it done." He bowed his head again and quickly backed away, eager to please the woman who now owned his entire livelihood. Jamal raised his crystal flute, the champagne catching the light. To the new owner of Oakwood, he said with a grin, "I have to admit, buying the country club where your family humiliated you just so you could legally revoke their membership is a level of petty I deeply aspire to reach." I picked up my own glass, tapping it gently against his. "It is not petty, Jamal. It is simply taking out the trash." I took a sip of my drink, looking out over the sprawling green golf course. The air felt incredibly light. For 35 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations. I had shrunk myself down, hiding my success and my power, foolishly hoping that my compliance would eventually earn their love. I had allowed them to treat me like a scapegoat because society constantly preaches that you must forgive your family, no matter how deeply they cut you. But blood does not grant someone an unconditional license to destroy your mental health. Biology does not excuse abuse. I had finally learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you absolutely cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. I turned slightly, looking directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall to address the audience that had followed this incredible journey. They thought spilling coffee would leave a stain on me, but all it did was wake me up. I set my glass down on the pristine white tablecloth, my posture perfectly straight, radiating the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who had successfully reclaimed her entire narrative. The greatest lesson I learned is that biology does not equal obligation. We are often taught to endure toxic family dynamics for the sake of loyalty, but true family should protect your peace, not destroy it. My relatives mistook my silence for weakness and my lack of flashy labels for failure. They did not realize that real power does not need to announce itself. When you build your success quietly and establish firm boundaries, you become entirely untouchable. Never shrink yourself to make insecure people comfortable, because the most beautiful revenge is simply cutting off the dead weight and thriving. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment,